What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the fighting game tutorial series, we are going to be going over Tag Teams Part 4. In this episode of Tag Teams, we are going to be improving how our tag characters actually work. So in the previous episodes, we spawned additional characters to match our game mode. So if we're in a solos mode, we only spawn one character per team. Trios, 3, so on and so forth. The first thing you're going to notice when we come in here is that the characters are facing the same direction. In the previous episode, they were not doing that. In the previous episode, the characters were facing the right directions, only the main characters that are being controlled, the other characters were not. So you can see they do abide by the same rules and they're actually facing the same direction as the characters that are being controlled at the moment. Additionally, you can see that they'll actually take damage and their stun frames will occur and then they'll be out of them. We can also launch them now. So if we make some space here, I can launch this opponent. They get back up, all that good stuff. So they're basically handling combat the same way that any of the controllable characters are. There is one exception, and that is going to be throws. So if I throw them, it is going to work, but it's actually going to throw both the enemies because of the way we set it up. It's not too bad of a fix, but we're not going to include it in today's episode because it is a little bit more complex than the other things we're going over. Additionally, one issue you will see is that the camera edges move and they have no regard for the other characters on the screen. Now, normally when you're playing your game, you're not going to have these characters sitting here. They're going to be off to the side, hidden, because they're not active. So this isn't something we really need to worry about, but if you see the characters kind of jumping around when you move from side to side. So for example, I have a good condition here. So if I am to take my second character and move over here, you can see the characters are kind of jumping behind them. That is because the camera edges are trying to move with our basic logic, and now these characters are in the way, so it's kind of pushing them in and out of the way. That's okay, actually, because there's nothing wrong with this. Again, we're not actually going to have these characters sitting here, so we don't have to account for that situation. But we are going to be handling that type of tag team behavior in another episode when we have them actually coming in from outside of the boundaries and being possessed and controllable by the player. There's a few other things we'll cover today, but that's the gist of it. So anyway, before we get into this episode, if you want to get caught up in the entire fighting game tutorial series and check out everything we've done, from our commands like this one to our hitboxes, our match flow, and all that fun stuff, you can go ahead and click this iCard at the top right corner. That's the entire playlist of all the fighting game episodes. Alternatively, if you don't care about that, you only care about tag teams, I do recommend you watch the previous episodes because this is Tag Teams Part 4. Parts 1, 2, and 3 are going to be relevant for this episode. We're going to be building on that logic. So I'll link you to the first episode of Tag Teams right here in the top right corner. Now with that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started. So this is a code and blueprint tutorial series. We are going to be working in both the code and the blueprints today. Starting out, let's go to the code. So I'm going to go to Visual Studio. And I need to go to my fighter template game mode.cpp. So in the previous episode, I had mentioned we were going to fix the stun frames and the hit stop for the non-possessed characters in this episode, and we are going to do just that. So in the game mode, if hit stop is active, this is the period of time after a hit occurs where everything kind of slows down or stops completely, then we want the characters to have a brief moment where they can't do anything. And so because of this, the game mode is what manages when the hit stop ends. So if we scroll down to the game mode's tick function, you should see this behavior here. This behavior is for the timer. We can skip past that safely. The next logic is this behavior right here. So everything I have highlighted was in here from before this episode, but I've commented out these two sections now and I've changed them for these two sections. So in the previous episodes, we were checking to see if player 1 and player 2 existed, if they were valid, and if they did, end their hit stop once their hit stop frames were less than or equal to 0. Now this is important because player 1 and player 2 do want their hit stop to be ended. However, now that we have multiple characters on a single team, it's not just player 1 and player 2 we have to set all those characters to end their hit stop when hit stop itself ends. There's a few ways we could do this. A very simple way right now is just to disable the logic that we had. That's why I've commented it out. And instead loop through each of our characters arrays. So team 1 characters and team 2 characters, and then call and hit stop on each character in those arrays. Player 1 is part of Team 1 characters, and Player 2 is part of Team 2 characters, so it won't break anything, it will only add to our functionality. So starting off here, I have a standard for loop. We have 4 integer I equals 0, I is less than team1 characters.num, increment I, and then I grab team1 characters at index I and call end hitstop. It's that simple, just call end hitstop for all the characters on team 1. The same as for team 2, just for integer I equals 0, I is less than team2 characters.num, increment I, team 2 characters index I, call end hitstop. So again, this is just end hitstop for all characters on team 1. And the second one here is end hitstop for all characters on team 2. And now I'm going to remove the previous logic that we had, and this is what my tick function looks like. So that's your first issue solved, the hit stop and stun frames issue. That should be working now for all your characters, including the non-possessed ones. The next issue we're going to solve is in our fighter template character.cpp. So I mentioned in the previous episode and at the start of this episode that the characters were not using their physics, so they didn't have gravity, you couldn't launch them, they weren't actually touching the ground when they loaded in. All of this is because their physics weren't actually running when they're not possessed. By default, the character movement component on a character is not using physics if they're not possessed by a controller. There's a very simple toggle for this that we can enable. For now, we just want to enable it for the entire duration of the match. That could change as our game progresses, but for now, let's just make sure that physics are always enabled even if they're not possessed. So to do that, we can scroll down to our constructor and our fighter template character, and there's a section where we set parameters on our character movement component. We use get character movement, and then we grab a variable and set it. I've added one today, get character movement, and I'm changing the be run physics with no controller to true. So as it says, if there's no controller attached, basically if this is not possessed, we still want to run the physics on that, and so that's what we're doing. By default, this is false. That's why all those issues with physics were coming up, but now it's true. You won't have those issues anymore. Let's go to our next issue so we can actually start the editor again at this point because we're done with the code for today. The editor is back open, so now we can go into our default game mode BP. That's where our next issue lies, so default game mode BP. Let's go over to our level streamed event in this blueprint. So level streamed in is essentially when we load up the map. It's an event we have for when we load into the level for the first time, but also when we do a rematch. At this point, we do a lot of things like spawning the characters, determining what camera to use, we were checking to see if the players were valid, and then in the previous episode, we were setting the other player variable correctly for all the characters in the teams. And one thing we were normally doing in this series was setting player 2 to be facing right by default. Now, this is kind of silly because if they're facing right, they have to flip at the start of the match, but it started because we originally had this variable called isFlipped, and that was accurate for player 2 at that time, and then we never came back and changed it. So at this point, it was just setting is facing right to be true for player 2, and that was working fine. But we need to do this for all of our characters if we want them to all start the same direction, and so we can do that by using our previous for loop from the previous episode. So you can see I have my team 2 characters and I'm looping through them, and in here is where we were setting other player for each element in there. We also want to now set them to be facing right at this point. I can drag off my array element, set is facing right, and we can set it to be true. And we can do this in the loop body because we want it to occur for everyone. Now, we want it to do that, and we want to set other player. We don't want to connect the loop body into the main line here, or it will keep doing this logic. We only want to do it on completed, so make sure you don't connect the loop body into here like I did there. That was a mistake on my part, so make sure it looks like this now where it's empty and not connected. Completed should be connected to the next node here. Now, player 2 is facing right at disconnected, though, because now it's going to be set in this loop, and we don't have to do it separately. So we can remove that and make some space here. And something like that will do. So just as long as we do that, now all of our characters on Team 2 will rotate properly at the start. Again, the naming is a little weird here because it originated as isFlipped and we never changed it. But by setting this to true in the character's tick function, it will check if it needs to flip at that point, and they do need to flip, so it will trigger that on that first tick. So You won't notice anything wrong about it, but we technically should update it so that they're facing that direction to start. That way we don't have to flip them here. But otherwise it doesn't really matter. Just for a conceptual reason it's a little confusing, but otherwise it's okay. Anyway, we should be good to go there. Now the last issue that I want to fix, but we're not going to fix in today's episode, is the throw. And that is because of the has landed throw boolean. So in the AnimBP for your character, has landed throw is what is being determined to perform the throw animation. So if we actually get to our get thrown rule here, we look at the character reference, we grab the other player and see if they've landed the throw. Has landed throw is set to true when the throw hitbox collides with this character. However, that is not going to work anymore since we have multiple characters on our team. So this is what we'll be addressing in the next episode. And then after this episode, everything that works for one character should work for the other characters as well. There will be updates to our camera and we will have to possess them, but all the actual combat for these characters will work together. I'm very excited to see that. So anyway guys, if this helps you make your tag team in your game, then please subscribe. It does more for myself in the series than anything else you can do, and I really appreciate that. I also want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership, Patreon, and Discord subscriptions. Thank you all so much for the love and support. I am very grateful and it helps the channel more than you could ever know. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community and reach out to me. I'll be happy to help you. Otherwise, guys, that's all I got. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.